Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for August 18th, 2021. I'm going to continue to focus on the situation involving Afghanistan and the US-NATO withdrawal and the chaos that occurred. But I want to approach it from the standpoint that there are people pointing fingers everywhere, but there has been very little serious reevaluation of what the policy should have been from the West and what it could be. So I want to take that up by starting with what Helga Zepp-LaRouche said yesterday in an interview she did. She started by saying, look, it's not all doom and gloom. It's good that this 40-year war has finally ended. It was ill-defined from the start. It did not have a competent strategy. We were lied to repeatedly. And she said that the potential, if we recognize that, is that we can now integrate Afghanistan into regional economic development perspective, which would include an agreement between Russia and China, but also bringing in India, bringing in Iran, bringing in other nations in the area, including Pakistan, and base this on extending the Belt and Road Initiative as the most significant development project that could transform Afghanistan into a modern transportation hub for the east-west trade, north-south trade routes as well. Now, what we have to recognize is that this is, as German Chancellor candidate Laschet said, an epochal change, that this was a complete failure of NATO and the West. And what Helga Zepp-LaRouche said in endorsing that statement is that we have to recognize this is the end of an era, an end of the assertion that Western values can be imposed at gunpoint on nations regardless of their sovereign institutions and regardless of their culture. That this idea of Western values as a rationale for war has failed over and over and over, not just in Afghanistan. And this should put an end to the arrogance of the idea that the intention of a unipolar world is right. This goes back to the Project for a New American Century, to the Bush administration, and so on. Francis Fukuyama's End of History. And it was a fraud. The idea of assertion of unipolar power based on US military has now been exposed for what it is, which is an imperial aggression against nations that refuse to accept surrendering their sovereignty and giving in to the idea of a rules-based order of arbitrary rules dictated by one superpower. Now, we should have seen this coming. There are so many indications, but I'll just mention a few. There was the 2010 WikiLeaks report on the Afghanistan war, which showed atrocities being committed for no ostensible purpose. The next phase in this was the statements from General Douglas Lute, who is the assistant to both President Bush and President Obama on the Iraq and Afghan wars. He was called the Afghan War Czar. And in 2015, he gave an interview, and here's what he said. And I know some of you have heard this before, but listen to these words again in the context of what happened last Sunday, August 15th, with the fall of Kabul. He said, quote, "We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing." Now, this is after 14 years of war, 14 years of American presence. He said, quote, what are we trying to do here? We didn't have the foggiest idea of what we were undertaking. And then he concluded this statement by saying, if the American people knew the magnitude of this dysfunction, 2,400 American lives lost. Now, that's the end of the quote. This is an important point. The point man for two administrations admitting there was no strategy, no orientation, no exit strategy or victory strategy. And that's what we saw unfold in the dramatic events of the last weekend. Now, similarly, we have a statement from the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, John Sopko. His statement comes from the release of a report which was an investigation of waste and fraud in Afghanistan. And he said that this investigation demonstrates, quote, "the American people have been constantly lied to," unquote. SOPCO's report shows the military strategies were flawed. There was massive corruption, not just from Afghanistan, but including the U.S. contractors. And all of the points of loot and what SOPCO is saying were manifest in the 2019 publication of the secret documents by the Washington Post, which confirmed that not only was there no strategy, but no competent plan to achieve peace. So the question that comes up, and that people are saying quite often, is, well, is change possible? And much of that is aimed at the Taliban. Now, the Taliban had a press conference yesterday, which was quite striking in what they said. Has the Taliban changed? Well, we don't know. We'll see. But they did state there would be no retribution, including against people who served for the American and NATO forces in overseeing their country. Secondly, they would accept women at the workplace, women in educational institutions within the framework of Islamic law, in other words, proper dress, head covering, and so on. They said they would allow no terror bases to be set up in their country and would not interfere in other nations. And finally, and this is really crucial, they will shut down opium production. As we presented in our July 31st special conference on Afghanistan, there was a plan by a UN official, Arlaki, to shut down opium production. And they were moving in that direction until the European Union and the United States sabotaged it. Will the Taliban hold to these promises? Well, we don't know. But the Russians and Chinese have said they're willing to work with Afghanistan, bring Afghanistan into this regional development framework, provided they stick to these promises that they're making. So we'll see. We don't know for certain what they will do. There are a whole lot of contingencies that could interrupt this, including especially the British role, because the British Defense Minister, Ben Wallace, was practically crying at the prospect of losing this intervention area that the British have exploited so often since the 1830s and 1840s in their great power confrontation with the Russian Empire. But that brings up to the next question. What about the US and NATO? Will we change our policies? Have we learned something from this? If we demand change of the Taliban, will we tolerate faked intelligence reports, faked military reports, unconscionable amounts of money poured into so-called nation building, for which there may be a library or two, a school or two, but essentially the lives of the people of Afghanistan have not changed substantially despite over $1 trillion spent. Some people say $2 trillion. So how do we get change in our policy? Well, you don't get it by finger pointing. I find it somewhat striking that Donald Trump is saying that he had a better plan for evacuation than Biden. He's the one who made the deal with Taliban back in February 2019, I think, or 2020. This is a manifest failure of the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration, Obama-Biden administration, and the Trump administration. Trump wanted to get out. Well, Biden got us out. Was it the right way to do it? Well, is there a right way to end a 20-year war? The right way is to have a full accounting of who developed the flawed strategy. Who stole the money? Who is it that's continuing to say the United States should now wash our hands of Afghanistan and take up the challenge of going to war with China and Russia, or regime change in Venezuela or Iran? We have to use this as an opportunity to make the deep state operatives who are behind this pay the price, because they've been making the American people pay the price in the form of casualties, of American lives lost, of American lives destroyed with the wounded and traumatic stress disorder, of the trillions of dollars taken away that could have been invested in dealing with drug problems and dealing with education, transportation, and so on in the United States. Hold people accountable. That's the issue for the United States right now. Not the Taliban. We have no say over what they do. We can encourage them. We should participate in a reconstruction of Afghanistan. But it shouldn't be done by the same people who destroyed the country and ran this war. So we'll have more on this in the days to come. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll be back with you tomorrow.